Many Americans point their finger in the wrong direction when they blame China for their economic troubles. The real culprit is corporate greed, says Jeffrey Sachs, a leading U.S. economist who joined me from New York City to explain why. Then we commemorate the World Day to combat desertification and drought. How does Chinese expertise come into play in fighting desertification in West Africa? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. China is not an enemy, says Jeffrey Sachs, one of America's leading economists. And if the U.S. were to curb China's growth, that could prove disastrous for the U.S. itself. In a recent commentary, Professor Sachs blames corporate greed instead of China for America's economic problems. He had previously accused the Trump administration of so-called gangster tactics against the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei, although the backlash to that critique led him to close his Twitter account. How exactly could slowing China's growth harm the U.S. and the world beyond? Ideally, what should relations between the world's two largest economies look like? I was joined from New York City by Professor Jeffrey Sachs himself, who is director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. I started by asking him why he believes China is not the source of the U.S.'s economic problems.
The economic relationship of China and the United States is very important. It's been growing and it's been mutually beneficial for both countries and for the world. The problem is, however, that inequality in the United States has been rising over time, and partly the trade with China is a factor in that, trade with China has raised profits of many American businesses, but it probably has lowered wages or at least stopped wage increases in many sectors that compete with Chinese goods. So we have had more inequality and also rising overall income. My view is that, as is standard in trade, we should keep open trade, but also have more redistribution of income within the United States. The rich have been very successful at resisting taxes. Indeed, they have been advocating and lobbying repeatedly for tax cuts for the rich. And therefore, the government has not been in a position to help those who have been disadvantaged by trade. So there is a growing pressure against trade. But this is misguided. The pressure should be for redistribution from winners to losers, and thereby everybody would benefit from an open trading system. This is what I've been arguing.
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping said mostly in St. Petersburg that as the global economy changes, there will always be those who benefit and those who miss out from the globalization trend. It's an issue of distribution that some people's interests are harmed, but he says we cannot stop eating for fear of choking, meaning we should not stop globalizing for fear of being, let's say, made even more disadvantaged by the side effects of globalization. Do you agree with his theory that we should continue to globalize in order to solve the problem, especially for the United States, namely the income inequality? Will such problem be solved in the course of greater globalization, or does America need to retreat?
There are at least three benefits of globalization that are extremely important. One is that a global economy adds to efficiency and overall wealth in the world. We've definitely had more global economic growth as a result of China's integration into the world system and as a result of an open trading system by and large. So there are benefits of globalization that are widely shared. Second, globalization is extremely important because we have a lot that we need to cooperate on. In other words, not only trade, but we have to cooperate on issues like stopping human-induced climate change, reducing pollution, protecting the natural environment. And globalization is an invitation for cooperation. China, the United States, and Europe need to be cooperating on solving major global challenges. The third big reason for globalization is that if we retreat into spheres of influence and clashes, we will have much more chance of dangerous conflict, which is terrifying, completely unnecessary. There are even some people talking about a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. This is an awful thought. We need peace, we need cooperation, we need to understand that we are in a mutually beneficial relationship when we have openness, when we have peaceful trade, when we're trying to solve global problems together. Mm-hmm. The last thing in the world we need is a Cold War. So President Xi is just right on this point. We need to pursue globalization. We need redistribution within our own countries to keep inequalities reduced, and we should be cooperating globally to help those parts of the world that are left behind, and also to solve these massive global challenges like climate change that require all of us to be working together.
How can you persuade the American business circle, American workers, that globalization will not mean lose for them or for one side?
Well, of course there is competition in specific markets. The best way to ensure that the competition is viewed as fair is that we operate according to shared rules of the game. That's why we have a World Trade Organization. There are lots of complaints on both sides. I think if we focus on keeping a rule-based system, putting our complaints through a rule-based adjudication, this is really important. Transparency is important. Connections, academic and scientifically, technologically, between our countries is important. It's so easy for one side to just accuse the other side to make accusations in return, and soon enough we could face a terrible problem of threats and counter-threats and a spiral of distrust. This is what really makes me afraid, because I know how important a good, open, peaceful relations between the two countries are. These are the two largest economies in the world. We do not want a descent into massive distrust and conflict, but unfortunately, that's the way things are heading right now, in part because of the provocations in recent months.
What do you think is the source of this this deterioration of our mutual trust? And you're talking about you being afraid. Actually, among the American general public, I think there is also this potential fear factor of, in the not so distant future, when China becomes even more stronger or overtakes the United States as the world's largest economy, China is going to do this and that, and be a hegemon and stuff like that. Where do you think all of this is coming from?
Well, I do think that the U.S. has been in the habit of mind for the last 75 years, more or less, that it runs the world. And the U.S. is very rich, very powerful, a technological leader. And the idea of U.S. foreign policy since World War II has been that the U.S. should be the predominant power in the world. The problem is that China is a big, productive, successful, growing economy. It's got a population that is more than 4 times the United States population. And this means that as China gains technological advancement and gains prowess with a growing economy, of course China is going to become roughly the same size as the U.S. or even larger. By one measure, using international prices, the Chinese economy is already larger than the U.S. economy. By another metric, using market prices, the Chinese economy is smaller than the U.S. but growing. In fact, of course, in per person terms, China remains still a developing country, lagging rather far behind the U.S. and Europe still in per capita income, but it's growing and gaining technological mastery. Well, this is making a lot of American politicians and policymakers and businesses very nervous. Hey, how can China be so big all of a sudden? How can China be a rival to the United States? And so forth. But these are facts of life that I think we should work towards mutual understanding and welcoming. The rise of China's economy has been a huge benefit for the Chinese people and for the world economy as a large, in fact. And China will continue to develop, and many of China's successful technologies are a huge benefit for the world. Two come to mind. China developed the most effective cure for malaria, won a Nobel Prize for that, and it saves millions of lives with this Chinese discovery. China's photovoltaic or solar panel have come down in price so much that suddenly we have a clear path to climate safety by tapping large-scale solar power. I use these examples to show that these are mutual gains for the world, but there's a lot of fear factor. Politics, as we do in the United States right now, fear can easily dominate rationality. That's what's happening.
Yeah, on the other hand, President Donald Trump does talk about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, which is a very important pillar of the economy. And over the past few decades, the U.S. economy has been, the U.S. manufacturing has been effectively hollowed out. You have a very strong capital market, but you don't have this kind of manufacturing, which is, you know, the backbone of any economy. So given the current circumstances, given that Chinese wages are still lower, and wages in other parts of Asia, for instance, or in Africa, are still considerably lower, that manufacturing is probably unlikely to go back to the United States in a conventional way. What would be your suggestion then in this sense?
Well, the fact of the matter is U.S. manufacturing in many areas remains strong, but the number of jobs has gone down considerably from a peak of around 19 million jobs to currently around 12 million or so. Those jobs are not coming back in significant numbers, and most of them were not lost to offshoring to China or to Mexico or other places. Most of them are the result of automation and rising productivity. It's true in China too. Manufacturing jobs are not the way of the future. Service economy is where most of the jobs will be over time, because automation, smart systems, robotics is already replacing so many jobs, and that trend is going to continue. Again, this is a matter of national policies to help make sure that workforces are well educated, well trained for the skills that are needed, rather than trying to protect jobs that are made obsolete by changes in the structure of the world economy.
Yeah.
Most of America's job loss by far is not due to shifts of jobs to China, though some of those jobs are. But as you mentioned, those jobs are not coming back in any significant number. But it was politically convenient for Donald Trump to campaign on the idea that he'll bring those jobs back. It's naive, it's not good economics, but it did work politically.
Yeah. Oh, finally, you said that the conflict that China and the United States are seeing at this moment, if without any greater wisdom, could lead to utter disaster for all, first economically, then geopolitically and militarily. So if you would like to give a piece of advice of greater wisdom to the Chinese side, what would you say?
Well, I think China, of course, should first and foremost abide by and defend the multilateral system. We have WTO, we have a rule-based system. I think China should be a strong pillar of that system. It should urge countries that have issues with China, let's negotiate within the context of the WTO. And especially as there are new sectors rising, the digital economy, new forms of intellectual property, it's even more important that we have these multilateral negotiations under a rule-based system. I think that China should absolutely offer transparency. It should demand reciprocity of that transparency on the other side, but it should appeal to the United States and to global opinion for strengthening multilateralism, not retreating from the globalization, because that is important for all. And I think on many of China's important multilateral initiatives, most importantly the Belt and Road Initiative, which involves dozens and dozens of countries after all, it would behoove China to show great global leadership on sustainable development, on cleaning up the pollution, on shifting to renewable energy, on showing that China is a leader of multilateralism, a leader of sustainable development, a promoter of rule-based trade. And I think that China's voice for that kind of reason, calm, and a global effort for sustainable development and multilateralism is essential.
All right. Well, I hope that China does keep these points in mind. Of course, I think it is a little early for China to talk about any global leadership, but we have to work towards that goal, at least in spirit.
If I may say so, it's not that we need a hegemon. We don't, and there can't actually be a hegemon anymore. China will not be a hegemon. The United States, while it thinks it may be, is not a hegemon. We need global cooperation, not hegemons. So when I talk about China and multilateralism and sustainable development, I'm not talking about China leading the world. I'm talking about China being a strong example of partnership in the world. And I think that this is the lesson the United States needs to learn as well, that the days when one country would be the hegemon over others are passé. We are in an era where cooperation among many powerful regions and many interacting regions is essential. A non-hegemonic world that is linked together through global rules and a commitment to the United Nations and a commitment to sustainable development.
That was my interview with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University.